Hi again. In this session, we'll look at contributory and non-contributory social protection. So last time we started the discussion when we looked at financing basic concepts in financing social protection. So it's also, we looked at, like we said, that the coverage in countries in general at two ends. One end that you have the contributory system here, right? And one is for the vulnerable, the social assistance, but we have the coverage gap. So the idea, we said we need to move people from here, like you start with taxi drivers, medical doctors, like taxi driver to get your registration to run the car, that you need to contribute to this contributory systems, maybe professions like doctors, lawyers, but also like the poor, you can shift them here. We discussed this before, right? So the point is where we head from these silos, what we said, we need to move into like creating synergy, and we introduced two more objectives about creating the synergies between the contributory and non-contributory system, where you have at the lower level here, you have the recommendation 202 of the ILO, which is the social protection floor recommendation. So when you combine them, you bridge the coverage gap, but the question is how, and this is what we will try to do now. And in the how, this is usually the situation in many countries, and you have social insurance. As I said, it might cover only the civil service, but in most countries that it covers all those salaried. You work in a bank, your employer contribute for social insurance, for retirement or somewhere, right? If you work in a formal sector somewhere, it will cover the formal sector. And then the rich, they can have the voluntary insurance on top of it. But what we recognize in this situation here, that you have two things here. One is gap. As we discussed, this gap is the informal sector. So this gap is important to bridge it. But even within the social insurance, you have many people, if this is the minimum standards of living, many people, they are in the social insurance, even civil servants, and the adequacy issue, they get a pension that is not sufficient. So they are here, below the minimum level. Right. So two issues here. One, you have the coverage gap and the benefit is inadequate. So how we can create, how we can extend. As I mentioned, we need to extend coverage by people in this gap. We try to get them here. As I mentioned, you start with, professions that are organized, like car drivers, like doctors, like, you create, sector by sector, even like small shops, you can, usually they are registered in chambers of commerce that you can, create agreements with them. But the problem here is the wage is low. And to tell them we wanted to deduct contribution for your retirement, it's very difficult. It will create... So it's important to create a subsidy. Like the program that when you shift them from here to here, it has to be a rate that is exceptionally, low, especially for the very informal. And it usually, many countries, the government comes in, for the low wage earner, that we will just pay this little amount. The government will put this amount into the social insurance fund. And why they wanted to do this way, it's again, you want to close the coverage gap. Because if somebody, let's say taxi driver, gets into an accident, work-related injury, will go to the healthcare, will cause lots of costs in the whole, in the healthcare system, as well as, they will go to the social security to claim, not to the social security, the social assistance, because they are poor, to claim benefits. So it's better, to create a system where they can contribute for work-related injury if it happens for the government, right? It's because it will be cost saving as well as reducing vulnerability in the country, right? So it's subsidized. Even with this level of subsidization, it's still very difficult to reach to the, for instance, rural communities, fishermen and women, and people in rural communities work in small farms, and or people in urban slums. So it's very difficult to reach to them, and that's again, the extension through the social insurance has a limitation. And that's why you see many countries now, they say, okay, it's very difficult to do that, very difficult to extend. It will cost us more than just cover them all with a very low benefit. very low benefit of social pension that, especially in low-income countries, in sub-Saharan African countries, old age citizens are 2 to 3, 4%. So it's easy to cover them in tax funded, not necessarily tax funded. Sometimes, donors' money are channeled into this fund that will cover. But it's also, remember, because there is also the issue of inadequacy. So you might keep it to allow people, even the low wage earner, to combine them, right? As we discussed when we talked about type 1, type 2 error, you let the tax correct for the inclusion. If somebody is included here, rich, you let the tax correct for it, because there will be tax that will correct for it. But this is one modality. And now the second question comes to us, which we started, we discussed what the difference between defined contribution and defined benefit. As you remember, defined contribution is what you put, what you get, right? So you and your employer, you contribute, and based on what you contribute, you get at retirement, you get the annuity or the lump sum or whatever, based on your contribution. There is no promise. You're not promised a fixed income at retirement of specific amount. It's based on your level of contribution or your accumulated contribution, also the return on investment over the period. Defined benefit, as we discussed, it's already once you are in the labor, once you are in contractual agreement in the formal sector, you are promised a level of pension based on an equation that takes into account how many years of contribution and the last wage. So you are promised a benefit. Because of this distinction here, the decision whether it's defined benefit or defined contribution has a very important consequence in time of increased aging or the aging transition, like in many countries. Defined benefit tends to have higher and higher costs, and then you need to balance the system. Well, defined contribution, it's not like this, right? So for the defined benefit, then government started in defined benefit is like the idea of to have the tax funded as well, to bridge the coverage gap, but also, as I also mentioned before, because the defined benefit, you're gonna revisit the contribution rate to balance the system. You have less and less worker, so you revisit the contribution rate to balance the system. That will increase the cost of the wage cost, because it's contribution on the wage. So it makes countries, difficult to compete with other countries. So if they shift part of it to the tax funding, because tax, you can also spread it to value add tax, to different types of tax. So it will not be only on workers, but you spread it in segments of the population. So it will maintain, the cost of employment lower. But other, like the issue here, it's still not sufficient, right? The tax funded, because of this one might be difficult. And just one example, look at Malaysia here in 2000, you have 16 workers. So every senior citizen, you can chip in from 16 workers to support, the dependency ratio. In year, they don't have 16 workers for everyone, but you have 10. Then you have 4. So if you have a contribution rate here of 1%, to maintain the same level, you need to 1.6%, right? Here you need 4%. So if you have 4% here, you need here to make it about 6.7%, and here you will make it 16%. So it's the contribution rate. So you keep increasing the contribution rate to balance the system only, and that will make the workers not competitive, right? So it's important for countries to look at it simply because of this. You remember this equation, right, when we talked about it, because this increases will cause this one to increase. So this is defined benefit. So many countries as well, in addition to cut people to the tax financing, spreading the pressure on the working age, they also take to the defined contribution. They say, well, we cannot promise what we used to promise. You need now to work harder to say, we promise up to this point. So we're introducing another layer of defined contribution, that this is what we offer you. They lower the benefit amount, and they lower the benefit amount. So this benefit ratio now, they lowered it. But they say, well, we know it's lower now. If you're not comfortable with this one, work harder and contribute here. so you can maintain what you used to get in the past. Right? So they create another layer of defined contribution. Obviously, this will, as you would see in many countries, that you would have always, the population will not take it at face value. That's, oh yeah, it's okay. Usually there is resistance because there is entitlement. Once you enter in agreement defined benefit at one point, I cannot, there is a contract here. You cannot at middle of the way to say, well, we cannot afford it. Well, I was promised. It's part of the employment cost. It might be, like many countries would say, for the new entrance into the labor market, we enter into new contractual agreement, right? But the existing, it's very difficult. So the idea here is to shift from defined benefit to defined contribution and to tax funded. And this is where it becomes, very interesting. In some countries, it's already defined contribution, like Malaysia, and they don't have the tax funding. What is in Malaysia, the story, defined contribution, the problem is the low wage earner, they will have little amount of saving, little amount. In Malaysia, people can withdraw at age of 55, at very young age, right? Because when it was established, this program in 1950s, life expectancy was 57, so it's okay. But now life expectancy is 77, but they didn't increase the age. People can withdraw at this age, and what on majority of people, 2 out of 3, they have saving so small that will cover them only 5 years. So the point about defined contribution, if it's very low, the accumulation, not for everyone, of course, the rich will accumulate a lot. So many countries, and that's where policy recommendation we've been discussing in Malaysia is to create a tax-funded, layer, right? So, and the combination, firstly, defined contribution does not distribute from the poor to rich. This is saving for yourself, saving when you are working to the time when you're not working. So there is no cross-subsidization or solidarity here. Once you introduce a tax funded, because taxes will be usually at high, will be paid by the more affluent. So now you create the tax funding will create the solidarity. Remember when we said solidarity at the system level. At this level here, there is no solidarity. But at this system, when you include the tax funding, the overall system will create the solidarity. So the recommendation for countries with the only DC is to include tax funded. Right? And many countries now, they don't even have the system except for the civil service. And that might be, like an option to have to go start with DC and tax funded. It might be an option as well, as long as, like the studies, the actuarial studies modeling that will secure people to have a decent retirement, right? So the point is we move from these silos into this, right? So whether it's defined contribution or defined, it's not the issue, but as long as you create the overall system that speak to each other, and you create cross-subsidization. The other issue here is where you need to look at, like this social fund. You get, employers' contribution, employees' contribution, employees get benefit, government contributes to the social fund, especially at the beginning, or for its workers, subsidies at the beginning, subsidize the social at the phase when they started, but also social insurance, many countries, because this accumulates a huge amount of money. Usually, and that can create loans and for the government that can borrow at later stage, or actually this can mobilize create saving in the country, culture of saving that can be mobilized for investments in the country to unleash development in the countries, whether in infrastructure, which brings good return for. So if they invest in infrastructure, that employees will, like the social fund will create also return on investment, because this is paying, good dividends in many countries. But also everyone benefit, create jobs, so employees will benefit, employers will have easiness to do business, so everyone will benefit. Right? The second last point related, like when we have a look at the system altogether, the other objective other than cross-subsidization is synergy. And synergy, there is the issue of data harmonization. Right? And part of the inclusion error, because you have so many fragmented systems, they don't speak to each other. So once we do this, move away from these silos, they don't speak to each other, and here so many broken silos, and you move it to a system that speak to each other, that harmonization becomes critical. There are different ways, different models, different studies, but now technology allows us to do different things, right? And in the past it would have been difficult. You don't need to merge databases. All you need to create like a surface, an interface platform that the different systems here, they don't need to share everything, but the system can speak to each other. So at least you can create like maybe the system use different database software than this one, but at least you create wrappers here that they make them speak to each other. So somebody can have want to access to specific information which is allowed in the law one of the system, that can access it. So we know who is getting what, for policymakers, and you need a common ID, right, for all of them, and this is where it becomes very important for the national ID to be used as the common denominator, because for all systems. So it's again like when you have a systematic approach, you bring all the pieces together, it allows you to create not only cross-subsidization but data harmonization that helps you to close the coverage gap. All right, thank you.